Hello, my name is Joshua Fitzgerald. I am a student in the engineering mechanics program at Virginia Tech, and my advisor is Dr. Shane Ross. Thank you for having patience with dealing with this unusual format. I contracted COVID shortly before the presentations, and as a result, I was unable to attend in person. My talk is entitled Geometry of Low Energy Transit Orbits and the Periodically Perturbed Restricted Three-Body Problem. So you might be wondering, what is a periodically perturbed restricted three-body problem? Well, in order to answer that question, we first need to understand what the circular restricted three-body problem is. The circular restricted three-body problem is the unperturbed problem, and it models spacecraft motion under two masses gravitational fields given several simplifying assumptions. So we have two masses, M1 and M2. They could be the Earth and the Moon or the Sun and Jupiter. We'll take them to be the Earth and the Moon for the rest of this. And the circularity requirement supposes that they must move in perfectly circular orbits around their common center of mass, which allows us to define a rotating reference frame in which they appear to be fixed. And then the restricted requirement presupposes that the third mass in the system is of negligible mass because it's just so small compared to the other two masses. It could be something like a spacecraft or an asteroid or a comet. And so low energy phase-space transit, which is an idea that we'll expand upon in the next slide, relies upon the equilibrium points of the equations of motion of the system, places of zero velocity in the rotating frame, which are the Lagrange points, the L1, L2, L3, L4, and L5 points. L1, L2, and L3 are called the collinear points because they lie in this line with M1 and M2, and L4 and L5 are the triangular Lagrange points because they form equilateral triangles with the two masses. So, low energy phase-space transit. How does it work? How does it work? So, at certain low energies of the particle, we can't move in this region of phase space. This is called the forbidden region because we just don't have enough energy to go through it. And by energy, I'm referring to something that's kind of like kinetic and potential energy. It's not exactly the same thing, but you can think of it as that. And so the equilibrium points, L1 and L2, are the only gateways between the three realms that result, the three distinct regions that are separated by this structure that we can't pass through. And so the three realms are the Earth realm, or the M1 realm more generally, the Moon realm, or the M2 realm more generally, and the exterior realm, which lies outside here. And we see that in order to understand how transit occurs, we need to understand the local dynamics about the L1 and the L2 points. So how do we do that? We use a mathematical technique called linearization, which simplifies the equations of motion in the vicinity of the Lagrange points. So consider a coordinate system in which we're going to be decoupling the different types of motion that follows. So this is a totally different set of coordinate axes. It won't look like the space that you're used to. And keep in mind, we're operating in the planar problem. We're not considering out of plane motion. And so we're operating in a four-dimensional position velocity phase space as a result. So we're going to be considering at first two of those dimensions, which correspond to the saddle projection. And in the saddle projection, we have the forbidden region here and here. And then we can define these two lines, each of which are entirely within one realm or the other, because this bounding line between the two realms is located right here. And then, so we consider initial conditions, which lie entirely within one line or the other line, and so entirely within one realm or the other realm, and we see where they go. The first thing to notice is that we have these initial conditions that correspond to sets of trajectories that asymptotically approach the equilibrium point, and also the center manifold, which I'll explain later, in forwards and backwards time, asymptotically. And these are called the stable and unstable manifolds. Now, because of existence and uniqueness theorems for differential equations, things on this side, you start along this line on this side, and you can't get over to the other side. You can't pass the bounding line. So these are non-transit orbits because they start to go in the region, but then they can't make it. They can't pass these stable and unstable manifolds, and so they bounce back out. On the other hand, these initial conditions, transit orbits, they can. They start over here, they pass through the line, and they make it to the other realm. And so the stable and unstable manifolds are the structures that separate the non-transit orbits, the non-transit trajectories, from the trajectories that do transit. And then we also have oscillatory behavior, which is due to the center manifold, which is encapsulated in the center projection. And so we see that the stable and unstable manifolds are actually approaching the point where this is zero, which corresponds not only to the equilibrium point, but also to all of this oscillatory behavior we see here, all of these orbits, these periodic orbits around it. So all of this is existing theory up to this point because we've been dealing with the unperturbed problem. But what happens if we want to add in a time-dependent perturbation that increases the system's fidelity to the real ephemeris? Well, there are several different ways to add in such a perturbation. We'll consider two common ones. So if we start out with the CR3BP, the circular restricted three-body problem, but we add in an extra mass, which from a distance circles the center of gravity of M1 and M2, this yields the bicircular problem, or the BCP. One example of this might be, if we have the Earth and the Moon, in the coordinate system that we're using, we can make it look like the sun is orbiting the center of the system from a distance. And then instead of doing that, if we want to turn on the eccentricity that was forbidden to us by the C right here, we can do that, and we get the elliptic restricted three-body problem, or the ER3BP. So now they are moving in eccentric orbits, and so they aren't fixed. But in this coordinate system, they're moving in these little ellipses near where they once used to reside as fixed masses. So here's the problem with all of this. Lagrange points are not invariant manifolds in perturbed systems. The points at which the equations of motion are zero are no longer even trajectories. You put something there, and because the vector field in these systems is time varying, it's instantaneously going to stay there. But then time is going to progress, and the point where there's zero velocity is going to move somewhere else, and you're going to just be sent off somewhere random. And we don't want this. We need something that stays in the equilibrium region that's a convenient invariant manifold that we can analyze, and so we're going to have to find something else. So our approach, we use higher dimensional manifolds, which we call Lagrange manifolds, which are sometimes called dynamical replacements to the Lagrange points in the literature. And these are the proper objects to replace the Lagrange points in these perturbed systems. So we foresee a hierarchy of increasingly topologically complicated Lagrange manifolds that result as your models get closer and closer to the real ephemeris. But we're going to take the first step and just say, okay, our zero-dimensional Lagrange point has bifurcated to a one-dimensional Lagrange periodic orbit under a single time periodic perturbation. So this is really helpful because Lagrange periodic orbits are invariant manifolds, unlike the stagnation points. They're actual trajectories. And you can see what they look like. So the Earth, Moon, Sun perturbed bicircular problem L1 point periodic orbit is doubly looping. You can see it looks like it loops back on itself twice, but it doesn't. They're slightly different. And its period is equal to the synodic period because the period of a Lagrange periodic orbit is always equal to the period of the perturbation. Then the ER3BP, it's got a bit of a simpler structure. It just loops once and it has the sidereal period. It's also much larger in position space. So linearization is not going to be suitable for dealing with periodic orbits. So what are we going to do? We'll use a technique called monodromy matrix calculation. And monodromy matrix calculation is a technique for determining the linear behavior in the vicinity of the periodic orbit after one cycle through of the perturbation. So let's say that we start here at time equals 0, and then we integrate to time equals the time of the period. Well, we'll be right back where we started at. And so this will appear to be a fixed point under the stroboscopic map, which strobes the system. And nearby trajectories, they might loop around the Lagrange point, the Lagrange periodic orbit in some way, but they'll end up nearby, and we can kind of take a map of what they look like under this strobing. And there's a technique that allows us to get a linear picture of what this looks like in the vicinity of the Lagrange periodic orbit in its monodromy matrix calculation. So here's an interesting mathematical result that ties kind of everything together. We have managed to show that this very straightforward Hamiltonian, which is quadratic and generates linear equations of motion as a result, it corresponds to the dynamics of this monodromy matrix that tends to result in the Lagrange manifolds that we see in these models. So these models generate monodromy matrices that correspond to linear elliptic-hyperbolic maps. And so let's see how this works. So we take the Hamiltonian, we generate its corresponding equations of motion. We take the flow map under one period. And so what we get is we get the trajectories that bounce between different bits. We just strobe it. Then we take the monodromy matrix from the full nonlinear Hamiltonian and the full nonlinear equations of motion, and we do an eigenbasis transformation, which is the transformation that I showed you earlier that decouples it into saddle and center projections and stuff like that. And this transformation shows us that the resulting maps are exactly the same for the quadratic Hamiltonian and the monodromy matrix. So why is this significant? Because this Hamiltonian is qualitatively of exactly the same form as in the continuous case, the unperturbed case. And so as a result, there's something very, very nice that we can say about the dynamics. The transit structure under this Hamiltonian is a discrete version of the CR3BP case. Otherwise, it pretty much looks the same. This is the CR3BP case, and we can see they move in these nice continuous trajectories. This is the perturbed case. And what we can see is they follow the same paths, they just follow it in a discrete jumping sort of way. In reality, the trajectory might go and do something weird over here, but then it must come back. Then it might go and do something weird over here, but then it must come back again, and so forth and so on. And this picture must hold at every phase. So we can generate trajectories like this. Again, these are the non-transit trajectories, these are the transit trajectories. And so these are the non-transit trajectories, and these are the transit trajectories. And what we see is if we take these out of the eigenbasis and we integrate them forwards and backwards from a small displacement from the Lagrange manifold, well, the red trajectories, the transit trajectories, are going to start out in this realm, loop onto the Lagrange manifold, and then loop back off in the other realm. The blue non-transit trajectories are not going to do that. They're going to start on, they're going to loop, and then they're going to loop back off on the wrong side, on the side from which they came. And this analysis holds at different phases for which you calculate the monodromy matrix. If you start at a different phase of the perturbation and then you do the same thing, the theory still holds, as I said before. We see that it loops on, and then only the red trajectories loop back off on the other side, in the other realm. And so that analysis, or those pictures, were for the ER3BP. We can also show a video of what happens in the BCP. So we have these two trajectories, which start out in the same realm, and they loop onto the Lagrange manifold in very similar ways. But what we see is The red trajectory is the only one that transits. The blue trajectory returns to the realm from which it came. And so, in this way, we have managed to find the way in which, in the periodically perturbed systems, we can have a very similar sort of transit and non-transit structure as in the unperturbed system. So that was my presentation. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. My email is joshfitz@vita.edu. And I would just like to thank everyone at the Virginia Space Grant Consortium for the very kind and generous fellowship and for this wonderful opportunity. I very much regret that I was not able to be there in person for all of the wonderful networking opportunities and for all of the wonderful presentations that I am sure are being presented. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it immensely.